People are dying.
Rhetoric in terms of unsourced heat pump.
We can find another future.
Hello, welcome to the Climate Week, Climate Debate UK's weekly live stream for the week 3rd of August 2023. And what a week it has been in the bleak midsummer. Frosty winds made moan, didn't they moan? And up and down the country, we haven't had the heat waves, we haven't had the apocalyptic weather that's been happening everywhere else, but that's what people have been trying to tell us all about. Meanwhile, it looks like the net zero consensus may be collapsing. So that being the case, that being perhaps one of the most momentous weeks in climate politics for a very long time, we're going to try and experiment a Twitter Spaces chat after the show. So please join in. I've got a little banner somewhere I can put up, give you some info about that. Maybe not banners. There we go. Yes. Join us after the live stream for a Twitter Spaces discussion on the collapse of the net zero consensus. Yeah, so moving on then. Incidentally, if you want to join the Twitter live stream, you do need, if you want to talk, you do need a mobile phone. You need to join in from an Android or an Apple mobile phone. Unfortunately, you can't join in from a desktop. You can just listen from a desktop. But you're welcome to speak, but you'll have to log in with one of those smartphones. So what has been happening in the world? It was declared by the UN chief Antonio Guterres that this was the end of the era of global warming and the beginning of the era of global boiling. I think what this tells us is that the leader, the Secretary General of the United Nations, is a very silly man, and this should alert us to the fact that the agenda has hit the buffers. This is an act of desperation. This is a desperate man with a failing agenda even, and this isn't what reasonable people do. This is not about how reasonable people speak. Right after his comments, which of course were reminiscent of his earlier claims, he 2,000 years ago at the end of the IPCC publication, or as it was published, Antonio Guterres called it a code red for humanity. The new IPCC chief, however, Professor Jim Skay, I'm not entirely sure that's the correct pronunciation, says that the 1.5 degrees is not going to be quite as dangerous or quite the tragedy that others, including Guterres and, of course, the many protesters that litter our streets, claim it is. This contradicts the UN chief, his boss, Jim Skay's boss, apparently. But even we might want to take issue with what Jim Skay says. The world won't end, which is true, if it warms by 1.5 degrees. It will, however, be a more dangerous world. Now, that's what I want to take issue with. More dangerous than what? We know that it was cooler a century ago, but we knew that there were 2 orders of magnitude more deaths from extreme weather. As far as, if we take a broader view than perhaps Jim Skay or certainly the Antonio Guterres wants us to take, we know that the world is a far safer place now, despite a much, or perhaps because of a much larger population. There is clearly there are clearly some trade-offs to be made here. But it's good that the IPCC is finally catching up with us and with reality. But the news from reality has to filter up to the likes of its chief, to the chief of the UN, who is, of course, barking mad. Speaking of barking mad global figures, suddenly getting a dose of reality. Tony Blair says the public must be spared the huge burden of net zero. And his argument is that China is the obstacle to this. As we've pointed out in previous weeks, China just is not going to play net zero games on the West's terms. And now what seems to be a conservative anti-climate policy talking point from the 2000s or perhaps even the 1990s is a mainstream position once again. The global political agenda has made no progress in 3 decades. And these new geopolitics, it seems, is just not compatible with Western green dreams. And I'm sure that's something we're going to be coming back to later on in the show. As the Project Gaslight fades, The Guardian desperately tries to rekindle the scare story, turning what the Greek government has admitted is a case of arson or multiple cases of arson into cases of human-induced infernos, as though they were climate change. It's almost a disappointed story. The Guardian having to admit these things, but these are always these kind of events. These, as we predict, as we point out, as they happen. Events like wildfires are man-made events. They are either the result of poor planning or poor policy decisions, or criminal things like arson. You don't need extreme heat or climate change to have heat waves. So the big news that's been happening in the UK, of course, is the post-Uxbridge net zero policy fallout. And of course, if you have been watching events, you will know that after Uxbridge, it seems that the Conservative Party, and to an extent the Labour Party, have got very nervous about about the net zero policy agenda. This seems to be the most significant development since then. In the last week, the issuing of many more North Sea oil and gas licenses, reflecting what many are saying is a very deep division and policy split. This has really upset George Monbiot, of course. It must be a great thing. And we can see him whinging here about this being just a fleeting political gain. The fact of people being able to heat their homes, power their businesses, power industries, is just a fleeting political gain. Which sort of tells us a little bit about where he's coming from. He also, of course, and he's a good litmus test for these occasions. He's holding Rishi responsible for undermining the survival of the habitable planet, and we need to see the truth of that claim. We need to put his comments into comparison with Jim Skay's. So he's obviously completely crazy. The Guardian uses the billionaire's threat to pull out of the UK. The same characteristic lack of humility that Monbiot has. And Ed Miliband too is absolutely furious with the government and is talking about, is talking, saying many things that maybe we'll come on to talk about in a moment. But I think he, a bit like Antonio Guterres, is a has-been. He's fighting for his political life. Everyone knows that he's a liability, not some kind of refreshing force for the Labour Party to sort of reinvigorate around some new issue. He's the creature of the Blair era, who wanted to be the man who saved the planet, but the voter just said no. And the world is just not something that Ed Miliband is capable of understanding. And much more to his disappointment, it doesn't look like Labour are taking much of a stand against the government. And perhaps Priti Patel is leading or saying what we're all thinking. But the question is, can the government and the Conservative Party really put their money where her mouth is, or are they all still attached to the Green agenda? And of course, there's been some pushback, which is coming from various quarters. Some people disappointed with the relaxation of net zero, and CNN and that sort of like trying to frame this as a culture war. Anyhow, right, we are joined, of course, by Climate Debate co-founder Ed Rennie. Ed, what do you think about this kind of post-Uxbridge thing? And it's been obvious, I think, for a long time that net zero is on the wrong side of a democratic deficit. It's got no means of being delivered, and it's ruinously expensive. Can a by-election really be the trigger for such a comprehensive awakening to reality? These facts. Is there more going on, do you think, to all of this?
I'm not sure it's a trigger. It's certainly a moment. It's certainly, as Pete North was saying last week, it was the first moment where net zero policies met with the reality of a likely electoral response. And certainly, we hope it should be a turning point for the extension of ULEZ. Whether it would mean the reversal of ULEZ and other nonsense so-called traffic calming policies in central London or elsewhere in the country remains to be seen. There's a couple of things. One reason it's not a trigger, for example, is that Keir Starmer was already on record as saying a new Labour government wouldn't bring in any new licenses for oil and gas, but would not revoke any that were introduced between now and the general election. So he'd already said that, and he'd said, well, that was, that's to give businesses predictability. You don't want to, it's kind of sort of sensible pro-business thing to say. So that wasn't prompted by the Uxbridge by-election. Now, the Uxbridge by-election may have accelerated this government announcement. They may have thought, well, we want to seize the moment here and do it now, but I suspect they were planning to do this anyway. And Jeremy Hunt was on, I don't normally watch Channel 4 News, but the Chancellor was on Channel 4 News just before we came on air. And he was saying, look, he was making a quite a relatively sensible point that, if we produce gas ourselves, it has less of a carbon footprint than if we import it. Now, of course, the Channel 4 News host pushed back because we don't have the same policy as America, where it's able to kind of, if you like, sell itself gas and oil. But anyway, Jeremy Hunt was making the point, even though it's a weaker one, given that we don't seem to be prepared to have the policies to say, well, we get first dibs on our own gas and our own oil, and it does just go into, if you like, a wider European market. So those seem to be two things to bear in mind. Yeah, go on. Sorry.
Why does domestic energy production? I mean, we're going to import it. Why does it make Ed Miliband and the others so cross? There doesn't seem to be that seems to be the main issue. It doesn't matter whether to them, it doesn't seem to matter whether we use it or not, whether we use gas or not, as long as we don't produce it. That just seems to be. Does he seem to think that there's something being lost by making?
Well, I mean, obviously, it's tempting not to ascribe rational thought to these kinds of people, and often the way they behave, as you were alluding to in the introduction, is that they don't behave rationally. But if there is a rational argument, in as far as you can make one out for them, it's that, well, hold on, everyone else is producing so much oil and gas. We're already producing so much oil and gas. We're just adding more to the pot. And if it were to bring down prices, it would have to be significantly increase the supply. So it's moving further and further away from the energy transition. But that just falls apart in terms of geopolitical context and everything else. Never mind the fact that the only way you're going to seriously approach net zero is to shift to nuclear, and that renewables cannot provide anything but kind of some light icing, or a little bit of spice on the top of our energy provision. So really, it's not based on any kind of rational analysis. And of course, the other point is we should be leaders. It's
sort of a political vanity.
Yes, political vanity, but also a kind of weird neo-colonialism. The way that we should be sorting out the world, us Brits.
So one of the arguments, I've spoken too much at length, so we're going to have to go through, in the introduction, we have done too much, but so we'll have to go through this a bit more quickly. One of the arguments that that people have been raising in the last few weeks, people like Alok Sharma and the sort of Green Tories, is that that it's suicidal polling. So it's suicidal to ignore the polling, and there's been some, of all places, the FT has run some interesting things here. So the FT is pointing out some polling that says, yes, indeed, most of the public want net zero in some way, shape, or form, but they're saying, quite rightly, if I can get the next slide up, people aren't willing to pay for it. It is a red line. The voter wants net zero, but not policies that will cause additional costs for ordinary people. And even, I mean, there's a big disparity between Conservative voters and Lib Dem voters, but not even Lib Dem voters are getting there. I'm going to go past some comments about the Lib Dems, but okay, I'll say it. There was a Lib Dem councillor who called for a Together declaration meeting to be gassed with. Lib Democrats are just nasty people, basically. I think that's what I think.
Well, they've gone round the twist. To a greater extent even than Ed Miliband, perhaps, it would seem.
Yeah, maybe, perhaps so. So yeah, but even support for unmitigated net zero, you might want to call it, is falling off in Lib Dem land. It's just not popular, is it?
No, and I mean, this is the thing: is that you can poll. Do you want nice things? Poll response majority yes. Do you want to pay X large amounts of your entire income, or lose large amounts of your income to get nice things? No, it's very simple. And there's one of the Blair occasionally talks sense, as we have seen, intermittent with when he says meaningless bland things. But one of the intelligent things he would used to say, and this was a guy who did, to be fair, know how to win elections. He would say, look, when you poll any issue, for example, he used British Rail renationalisation, and that, you would get massive majorities in favour of it. But if you did more detailed polling and questioning on the issue, the support would fall away as the policy implications were kind of sought out. Now, there's some pollsters who disagree with that kind of polling and say, well, you just have to ask these completely bland, neutral questions, and that's the only way for polling to be accurate. I think probably that's bunkum. And actually, the point is that if you get into the weeds of a policy, support drops off. for any noticeable popular policy that gets more than 67-70%, the more you analyze those kind of policies and the more the voters see what these policies mean, generally the support falls. And of course it is going to fall with any policy related to net zero.
Well, that's right. And
The heat pumps and the car bans and all the rest of it.
This is the beginning of net zero. This is after a decade or more of constant, unmitigated propaganda through the state broadcast, the BBC, Channel 4, Sky News, pretty much the de facto abolition of opposition from the mainstream. And they're not even getting 50%. They're not even getting any. There's no substantial support for the agenda. So this is as good as it gets for the green agenda, and it's going to get a lot more fierce for them, isn't it? And a lot worse. There's no way. There's no way that they can improve this because the cost is going to mount up, and the resistance is going to grow. Here, of course, are the people who are trying to push the government into ignoring the polls now. And one final thing before we come on to our guest is the media mainstream is really quite fiercely pushing back now, I think. And there was some remarkable interrogations by Julia Hartley-Brewer of Labour and Conservative politicians, cabinet and shadow cabinet, just revealing that they have no clue. These characters have absolutely no clue, no grasp of their brief. I won't talk about that too much because I think we should just get on with introducing the guest today. Would you like to do that? And I'll get rid of these slides.
So tonight, I'm really pleased to say that we're being joined by Dr. David Paton, who's Professor of Industrial Economics and an accomplished statistician. Viewers may have come across David on Twitter when he was giving regular updates on the COVID numbers over the pandemic and helped to expose a great deal of the flawed modelling that justified lockdown. That modelling that sought to extend lockdowns for longer, and that modelling that was used to argue that lockdown should have come earlier. And also, I mean, David did some excellent work during the Brexit, as I call it, interregnum, in relation to trade opportunities that would come our way should we leave the EU. You can find him on Twitter at cricketwyvern, so cricket as is normally spelt, and Wyvern as I believe the River Wyvern. In particular, I'd like to say that David is also highly skilled at explaining complex statistical and economic matters in an engaging manner using simple and easy to understand terms without dumbing down. Quite an important gift and quite rare, I think, in statisticians, unfortunately, given that their trade is extremely important. Obviously, some statisticians use that to obscure things. But David, if I can ask you, as I was alluding to, especially towards the end of the COVID lockdowns, people were starting to see that the modelling that was being used was being skewed to give a particular outcome, particular scenarios that were worrisome. It seems people are starting to sense there's a similar approach being taken with climate modelling. So really, my first question for you is, are you seeing similar abuses of the way models are being developed to show particularly worrying outcomes with regards to the climate and the way that was done for COVID infections, ill health and deaths? Is that something you're seeing as in your work?
Thanks, Ed, for inviting me tonight. So it's a pleasure to be here. And I think the parallels between COVID and net zero are really quite striking in all sorts of ways, and the modelling being one of them. So we have this sort of claim that we're in a complete crisis, backed up by the modelling saying, well, this is going to happen with COVID. We're going to see X number 100,000 deaths in the next few weeks unless the government intervenes. And with climate, we're seeing something similar, backed up by modelling. We're in this sort of climate crisis presented to people as if there is no alternative. And this is really key to the debate and how the media present it. It's not actually key to the scientific consensus to the IPCC reports, but both with COVID and net zero, we have this idea we go from, yep, there's a crisis, it's going to lead to the end of life as we know it. Therefore, we have to do these life-changing interventions and there's no alternative. And of course, in both cases, there's really big gaps in the logic and in the sort of stages, because what you're assuming is that firstly, the models are true, that we've got this big climate crisis. But secondly, we're assuming that the interventions with COVID, the lockdowns, shutting schools, shutting down playgrounds and so on, with net zero, this complete change to our lives, that will have a predictable and certain effect to redress the issues you've got. And actually, that's quite a big step of logic. Scientists may agree that there is climate change and humans are having a part. Making that link to then saying, well, if we now reverse these policies and we move to net zero, that will lead to benefits and these things being reversed in a predictable way, because of course we know climate change can bring benefits as well as costs. The same goes the other way. If we're going to net zero, are we so sure that we will have these benefits? That's the first thing. The second thing is that both approaches tend to ignore the costs. So they say, well, we've got to do this. There's no choice because of the crisis. But of course, the costs in both cases may be immense. And any policy has to take account of both of the benefits and the likely costs. And the way both COVID's, what I would call the COVID extremists, but also the climate change extremists get around this, they say, well, don't worry about the cost, because actually, if you do what we say, we'll be better off anyway. So they used to say with COVID, well, okay, we've got to have a lockdown because otherwise there'll be this disaster and hundreds of thousands of deaths. But if we lock down, actually we'll be better off than not locking down, because the economy will be hit by all these deaths anyway. And so the lockdown is actually better. It's a win-win situation. And people say something similar with net zero. They say, well, okay, we've got to do this because it's the end of life as we know it if we don't introduce net zero policies. But don't worry, net zero policies are actually going to be beneficial for the economy and we'll be better off because of them. Now, I think most people can see through that sort of straight away. If these things are really beneficial for the economy and for people, then you don't have to have the government intervening and banning things or stopping us doing things, taxing things out of existence. These things will happen anyway. Then, companies may need a little bit of help, and there's maybe a role for the government in R&D to sort of make sure that we make the most of these things. But if they really are a win-win situation, we don't need to do much actually. These things will happen anyway. So that's clearly a bit of a sham. But the other thing that strikes me with COVID is some of the rhetoric and what goes on behind the scenes. So we see that straight away people with COVID said, well, we are the good people. We're the ethical people. These other people want to see, grannies die and want to see deaths, and they are extremists. And you see these same words, I think, with net zero as well. You see the idea of consensus. You see science used. So we've got to follow the science. We've got to follow the science, and therefore lockdown's the only solution. We've got to follow the science, and therefore banning you from having your gas boilers is the only solution. Consensus is used. The word extremists are used. Far right is used. The idea, I think, which is not just restricted to these two areas, is to sort of other people, to say, well, these other people are the sort of people you don't want to be associated with. Deniers is another key word that is used both in COVID and in net zero. And I think this is really, well, I don't think it really is destructive to public policy and to debate, because in both cases you had these huge interventions which were life-changing, unprecedented changes to our freedoms, our liberties with COVID restrictions. Now the same with net zero. When you actually come down to the detail of the policies, we're talking about life-changing measures so that we will not be living life as we know it in the future. And that's really important. Why would you want to introduce these things without at least a debate, without challenge, without teasing out what are the real benefits of these things? What are the costs? Because it's presented, well, we have no alternative, but actually we still need to think about the costs. So just sort of taking that back a step, you're right, the modelling in both cases is often at the heart of it. And I think a switch to looking at hard-nosed data, what has really happened, is part of the solution. And we saw that with COVID. We've seen that now with the analyses which saw, well, actually, when you look at areas which introduce very strict lockdowns and vaccine mandates and shut schools, do they have better outcomes than other areas? No. It's not clear that there was any benefit on mortality at all. There may have been some slight benefit at best, but at the sort of level where you then think, was that benefit worth the huge costs we have? And actually, when you look at the climate data, it's really important to challenge head on this idea of, we're in this crisis of which there is no alternative. I had the privilege of studying economics with David Pearce. You may remember that name. He was the very first environmental economist at University College London. This is way back in 1987, 88. He was the first economist to take environmental issues seriously, really popularised the debate. I remember around about that time, 88, climate change was just coming on the agenda in his environmental economics courses. We've had 35 years of data and of people making predictions about what will happen if we don't intervene, to stop climate change. So it really is important to look at what's happened. And you look at the big headlines, you see things like food production has increased year on year with a bit of a blip during the COVID times, but even the latest year, food production per capita, taking account population growth, has been increasing. Well, that's one of the big predictions about the climate change deniers. You look at deaths from climate disasters, as we know, and Ben's talked a lot about this. Over time, they've decreased year on year. This is a key measure. Deaths from climate events and disasters. Are they going up? Well, no, they're not just not going up disastrously, they're actually still going down. Part of that, of course, because we're wealthier and we can deal with problems. It doesn't mean there's no problem. But of course, that's the issue, because net zero policies are designed to make us poorer, so to have less ability to deal with these issues. But there's no sign of that climate crisis. The same with lots of other measures. So just this week, we've heard about but the amount of area burnt, some terrible things perhaps happening in roads in certain places. But you look at the big picture, trends of forest areas burnt globally have been decreasing year on year, even in the latest year, 2022. And that's not because we've got less forest area. Actually, the area of forestry in the globe has increased over that period. So all these sort of big measures where you would expect to see some sort of signal, there's no sign of that climate crisis. It doesn't mean that there's no problems from climate that we may want to do something about, but this idea that there is no alternative, a bit like COVID, the evidence is simply not there. And I think actually we need to be clear who the extremists are. If you look at the IPCC, the UN climate change body, they're much more nuanced than what you might expect from what you see on the BBC and some of the other media outlets. They don't talk about these life-changing crises. They talk about significant costs from climate change, but they don't claim that there's a signal of increased floods or famines yet from climate change. They do suggest that there's perhaps an increase in extreme heat events, but they're much more nuanced. They talk about costs. They don't talk about life ending as we know it. And once you get into that debate, then that's when it becomes much more interesting, because you can debate, well, what are the costs? Are they the sort of level where it's worth doing these things? What are the costs of the things we're going to intervene? What are the alternative approaches? And that's the debate which we should be having. But of course, the extremists, the Just Stop Oil, and unfortunately many in the BBC and other areas, want to avoid that debate. And that's what I think has perhaps changed in the past few weeks. You talked earlier about the by-election. I think that's perhaps where things have changed. We can at least start to have the debate about the true costs, the true benefits of these policies.
Yes, well, David, that's incredibly helpful overview. I'm just wondering, I mean, you've already spoken about how these things are presented in the media, but do you have a particular view on how modeling and statistics are presented to the public, and how that misrepresentation is coming across and is being communicated? I mean, you've talked about how it's put in very black and white terms, but I mean, is there something about the assumptions that are put into the models that are used? I mean, again, this happened with COVID, and also that you have a range of outcomes, and that all the emphasis seems to be on the worst case scenario outcome. I mean, what's kind of your view on that, in terms of getting into the weeds on how statistics is presented in the media, particularly on these two issues?
Yeah, I think part of the problem is the models tend not to be statistics. They're theoretical models. And economists use models all the time. There's nothing wrong with them. They can help to identify and be clear about issues. They can sort of assume away things that perhaps aren't so important, and you focus on saying, well, if we do this, this is the sort of thing that might happen. But we need to be clear, they're not predictions or explanations of what has happened. They're saying, well, if we make these assumptions, this is what might happen. And we saw that with COVID. Certain assumptions were made, and if COVID infections carry on going on without any interruption, then we may end up with X 100,000 deaths. Same with climate change. Obviously, very, very different types of models in terms of, not epidemiology models. They're sort of looking at climate, technical climate models, which is, beyond my area of expertise. But the point is, they do rely on the assumptions you build into them. And in both cases, I think what is often missing is an idea of adaptation or responses. So with COVID, we had these models and they just assumed that COVID would carry on increasing irrespective. And actually we saw in practice, whatever the interventions were, COVID went up and down, it went in these waves, and it was sort of self-limiting to some extent. But what we also saw was that people respond. People just don't, they see reports of people dying from COVID, and they respond in behavioral ways. So for example, they may take less risks. They may be careful about seeing your granny if you know she's vulnerable, or you look at symptoms and you think, okay, I better be a bit careful. I'm sneezing, I won't go and see granny today. Or people in different situations take different risks. So if you're with your students and you're thinking, well, I get COVID, I'm probably not going to be that ill, I'm not a great risk to anybody else, you have less behavior change. Whereas if you're very vulnerable or you're with vulnerable people, you do more so. Now the models just ignored all that sort of self-limiting behavior. They said, well, things will only change if the government intervenes. But of course, as we saw, both because of behavior change, but also because of the self-limiting nature of infections, the way it went in waves, these things happened irrespective of government intervention. Now, it's sort of similar, I think, with some of the net zero models. We know that the models and the IPCC consensus is not talking about these dreadful, world-changing disasters, but they're talking about significant costs and climate events. Now we can argue about whether their models are right in terms of predicting them being more likely and that there may be benefits from climate change. Fine, that's a sort of really for the scientists to argue about. But what we do need to be clear is that there is a response. It's not just a question of us intervening and saying, well, the only alternative is to stop all our CO2 emissions. The response may also be to say, well, if we have climate events, how do we respond to deal with them? How do we prepare so we become more resistant to floods? But also, how do we deal with, say, floods or extreme weather? Simple example being extreme heat events. People tend to respond by having air conditioning where necessary, or better ventilation. Now that is a policy response of adapting to change. And we need to, it's important, I think, that we think about the response to climate change and possible costs of climate change as a range of responses, part of which may be reducing CO2, part of it may be adapting in some cases, part of it may be saying, well, actually, there's a lot of uncertainty where the costs and where the benefits may be, and that we will do a bit of a wait and see, but we will be prepared to respond when costs come up. Once you get into that debate, that's when it becomes much more rational, because we can think, well, like, okay, what are the costs of this move completely to net zero? What are the likely costs from not making that move? And I think Bjorn Lomborg is very good on this. Many of you will know his work. And I think it's interesting to me, Bjorn Lomborg is very much a centrist in this debate. He believes in climate change. He believes humans are a part of it. He believes that there are huge costs from climate change, and he thinks we should do something about it. People may argue about that.
One of the people who is less broad-minded than Bjorn Lomborg, or something more less centrist, has been Ambrose Evans Pritchard, who is sort of something of a lone voice at the Telegraph these days. The Telegraph's commentary on net zero has been really impressive recently. But I've got it on the screen there. I don't know if you can read it. I don't know if our viewers can read it either. So I'm just going to read out a little bit from Ambrose's response to Tony Blair. This is the stuff I mentioned earlier. What Tony Blair's new interventions. After reading his New Statesman interview, I am forced to conclude that he does not understand the elemental threat staring us in the face, that clean tech will entirely change the global economic system, not at some distant date, but this decade, and that China is currently, but not irreversibly, running away with the great prize of the 21st century. Now, that is a lot to unpack for anyone there, but there are some. He makes a number of claims here that I'm not going to take lying down. The first one is this sixth wave of the industrial revolution, the first wave being in the industrial revolution, and then some other sort of slightly smaller revolutions. But what's he getting at? Because he's very sure of himself, isn't he? He's very sure that there's this enormous revolution happening. But what difference does it? I mean, even on his own terms, if everything is powered from windmills, it makes no difference to us. That's not a revolution, is it? It just means rather than burning some gas, there's a windmill going round. What's he getting at?
It's a very good question in terms of what he's getting at. I suppose the argument would be, we've got government spending a fortune all around the world on these net zero interventions, and of course, when you've got that much money floating around, the government and companies being forced to change what they're doing, yes, there is what you might call a technological revolution. This huge investment in car batteries, in technology, and there'll be investment in heat pumps, and there will be technological change, and there will be some benefits from that, doubtless. Whether it's worth changing our whole lives because of it, and government spending that money is a different matter. But yes, there will be technological change. There'll be this, and there'll be all sorts of things going on, and some companies will take advantage of it better than others. What I'm not sure where he's right is saying that we're somehow missing out on that. There's nothing to stop companies in the West, investing in technology, or governments investing in R&D, and governments are spending a fortune on these things. China is running away with it. I think you might actually put this another way around and think, well, the governments are making a decision by pushing companies in a particular direction and a particular way of using technology that actually benefits what China has invested in over the past 20 years and continues to do so. So we know that China is way ahead and getting further ahead in investments in wind turbines, for example. They dominate the market for onshore wind turbines for the rotors. They've increased their market share. The top 15 companies in turbines are all from China. They've had massive investment in electric vehicles. So, what we're doing by the government moving technology or trying to push it in a particular way is certainly benefiting China because they have this comparative advantage. It's hard to know what he thinks we're missing out on. There's nothing to stop our companies having some involvement in there. So what does he mean by it? What does he want us to do differently?
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure what world he's living on, because he just says, he sort of argues at one moment the larger point is that Britain needs green energy rearmament as a matter of national economic survival. It's not clear, he says to me, where Tony discerns his huge burden, or how Lord Hammond conjures his £1 trillion pound bill for net zero. We it's the prediction of the National Grid, ESO, if I get the initials right, that the net zero transition is going to cost $3 trillion, and that's just for electricity. And then the organisations like the IET have predicted, estimated that it's going to cost in the order of £2 trillion to upgrade the UK's housing stock to net zero. We're only talking about power and housing there. We haven't even talked about transport, and we haven't talked about several aspects of industry. So according to my calculations, at least, £3 trillion is £45,000 per person. So he's not really taking much notice of what's being said outside. And it turns out, of course, that Vattenfall has pulled out of So at the same time, he will say there's this massively dynamic industry, the wind sector. The costs of wind are now prohibitively expensive. Sorry, do you want to comment on something?
Sure. I do. So this is, I think the real problem here is you get a lot. This is where people talk about green jobs. We're missing out on this green jobs revolution. I think that's partly what is getting on. The technology is one thing, but actually this huge investment in jobs is another one. And that's really important to pin down, because of course this idea that all this investment in new, wind energy, electric vehicles, electric heat pumps is going to create jobs is basically a myth, because we've got to think, we've got a certain amount of capacity in the economy. And if we're spending £3 trillion, or we're going to, tear out a load of perfectly good gas boilers and use a more expensive technology to put in their place, and the government's saying that it's got this target of 600,000 replacement heat pumps per year, and we know when they're hitting that, and they're saying to hit that, we've got to employ, 30,000 new heating engineers to get there. So people say, well, is that 30,000 jobs? Well, no, this is 30,000 jobs that might have been used in a more productive part of the economy. So it's 30,000 people doing something that we don't need to do. We've got a perfectly good technology that's cheaper. So we're going to be spending this extra money to employ people who could be employed elsewhere. So, not that you can translate directly from heating engineers to dentists, but potentially that's what we're talking about. Does the government invest in forcing people to train to be heating engineers, or does it give us more NHS dentists? And it is as stark as that in a way. If we think about that 3 trillion figure you just talked about, £40,000 per person, that's a good estimate. Another way of looking at it is this: that's 3,000 billion pounds just in one aspect. The annual budget for the NHS is about 180 billion pounds. For education, it's about just over 100 billion. So together, that's not far off 300 billion. So if we think of the whole education and NHS budget, okay, for the next 10 years, that's equivalent to about 3 trillion pounds. So when we think of the country spending 3 trillion pounds to make our grid suitable for net zero, okay, and we put that to people and say, well, okay, do you want to spend that money when you could, for example, double the budget on the NHS and double the budget on education? And we all know that funding isn't the only source of problems in the NHS, and that's a big debate. But you put that to people, or do you want to spend it on, better benefits, on better housing, and all these other priorities? And you put it to people like that, well, actually it becomes a very different debate.
So, it's the debate between sort of different options that we have. So I'm going to, and they sort of saying China's getting something right and we're getting something wrong, but through the policy choices. I'm just trying to find the other article. Here we go. This is a German publication, and they're pointing it out that Europe just, for all the choices that it has made, for all the promotion that's happened, of the pushes for green energy that have happened in Europe, it's China that's the market for the goods has been created in, or rather, we've created a market for these products. We can't compete, or we don't seem capable of producing them here, and there's a reason for that. It seems to me, and it seems to many people, apart from the likes of Ambrose, Evans, Pritchard. They are burning. I mean, I'm not a China hawk, or even, I'm not. I don't want to get into those weeds, right? I don't want to have this antagonistic relationship with China, but they're burning coal, and surely it's all as simple as that. Is that that's what makes it possible to make wind farms? Am I?
No, yeah, I mean, sure, it's a little bit more complicated, but yes, at heart, one of the reasons we can't compete is that we, through our policy, have increased energy prices, increased electricity prices, and that's one of the reasons why, we've been hit in the steel industry. We find it much harder to compete in these manufacturing industries because China hasn't. They have invested and they've kept in all sorts of energy. So, we can go down that route if Ambrose thinks we should be going down the route of increasing subsidies. It's going to be really hard to compete with China because of their lower energy costs and way they've invested there, but we can subsidize. We've done that to some extent. We've coped with higher electricity prices in our steel industry by subsidizing them, by paying them to keep the steel industry alive. Well, we can do that more and more, but of course there are choices here. Governments using our money to create higher energy prices, and then using more of that money to subsidize industry to keep it alive, means there's less money for other priorities. So it doesn't really get to the to the heart of the problem. You're right. China can compete better because of their lower energy costs. There's more to it than that. They have decided to subsidize at huge levels as well. We've gone silent. Do you want me to carry on? There's lots more I can say.
Well, there was just it's really an adjunct question to this, because
I think my connection might be fading slightly. Ed, do you want to come in?
Yes, sorry, I was
while
I was listening very intently.
Chat with David.
Yes. So if you go off video, Ben, and try and come back in when you've.
Yeah, no, I think my connection is slowing down.
Okay, so David, I mean, I think the answer to this is probably no, you can't, or it would be very difficult. But it does seem to me that, and you kind of, it was almost referenced in your previous answers, is that, obviously since well before net zero and all these kind of green policies, we were losing industry to China and the East, in terms of, our manufacturing base. But it seems to me that has tended to accelerate, and you could see it, perhaps Germany suffering from it a bit more because of not just net zero, but policies that were pursued from the late 90s. Now, I think it might be that your answer would be that your hunch is yes, that has made that acceleration more pronounced. But is there really, given everything else that's in play, I mean, that it's really, it would be quite a challenge to kind of zero in on, say, how much that loss of economic growth, just in general, and how much loss of industry to the East is being accelerated or driven by net zero style policies.
Yeah, I think the picture is a little bit more complicated than that. So we had, over the past 50 years, a lot of, we've deindustrialized and the big heavy industries have gone. But then in the last 20 years, there's been something of a recovery of UK manufacturing, and there's been huge investment, often by companies from the Far East in our, car manufacturing, but also other areas. So it's not just a one-way story. But I think, yes, irrespective of that, the shift towards net zero and the deliberate policies to essentially increase electricity prices by this move away from cheaper electricity, are a big issue in driving that policy, making it harder and making more reliant on other investments on other subsidies to drag investments over here and to limit that happening. But there's other more complicated things, and there's things are changed by different trading opportunities. We won't get into the Brexit debate, but there are both costs and opportunities there. And also the tax policy, and there's been talk about how that may affect things. But I think you can't deny, the big issue over the past 20 years, and certainly going forward, companies thinking about making investments here, is going to be energy prices. And I think the worry is both the level of energy prices, but also the reliability, because I think the technical issues with maintaining the grid once we move to electric vehicles, electric heat pumps, we're going to need drastically increased levels of electricity. Whether the grid can cope, so we've got this £3 trillion bill from National Grid, well, there's all sorts of issues there. We just this week we had the idea of the pylons that are going to be needed, and it was just the newspaper reports just said, well, yeah, of course we'll need a radical reform of planning, because basically we're going to have all these pylons put up in all these rural constituencies. Well, good luck with that when you get to individual MPs faced with local people saying, well, do I want these string of pylons put up in this beautiful area or in this farmland or what have you? Every single one will be a battle. So the move to, that's to even spend that £3 trillion for the national grid, even if we should want to. And that, I think that's pie in the sky. What we're going to see, I think, time and again, is reality meeting net zero targets. And we saw that in a very limited example with ULEZ, and it'd be good to talk a bit more about ULEZ because I think there's a link with climate change that most people haven't picked up. But you've got ULEZ, a very specific example. You're going to have the heat pumps. Another one, we know this move to ban the sale of new petrol-only cars by 2030. The government keeps saying that's set in stone. Really, you just think reality is going to hit sooner or later. We've had a little bit of movement on new licenses in the North Sea. That's positive. Why on earth wouldn't we want to be producing oil there? When it's going to be produced anyway. Economic reality. Not just economic reality, social reality, environmental reality, because remember, net zero measures are not necessarily good for the environment, is going to hit home. And I think that is increasingly going to affect policy decisions. And the politicians love to put these things off as far as they can. We're getting to a point where hard decisions have to be taken. And by hard decisions, I mean turning tail and saying, well, actually, that was a bit unrealistic. We've got to face reality. How you get around the law on this, because of course we've got climate change commitments, is another matter. But I think political reality will bite home.
Yes, and I think you're right in emphasizing ULEZ. I mean, I think we would love to have you back on the show again, and definitely we could talk more about your perspectives on ULEZ. Just one thing I wanted to throw in, because it has come up. It came up with Kath McBride. Was one of the problems with banning the petrol car. The two things really. One is that the deadline is not moving because industry has already worked on the assumption that this is happening. So my understanding is that it wouldn't help at least the car industry to delay it. Is part of my understanding.
Yeah. I don't. They make that argument. Sorry.
Yes, but do come in on that. And the second point being that, look, if we ban internal combustion engine cars, the production of, we can't export them. We've actually got a half decent market in exporting cars from this country, so we are losing industry in that sense as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure the ban is on production. I think the ban is on sale in the UK. So I don't know how that
Right.
would work. And going back to that, the earlier point, yeah, our car industry are working on that 2030. I suspect actually lots of them wonder whether that will be relaxed. But in a sense, so what? If you just say, okay, you can still work to that if you want, but you are not 100% committed to it. We'll relax it by 5 years. So perhaps we'll go in line with the EU. That's not a cost to the industry. They may say, well, it's not so much of an advantage because we've already got our plans and it would be costly to change it. Fine. But in a sense, what do you lose by doing that? Actually, I think there is more of a benefit because of the alignment with what's happening in the rest of Europe. And in California, we saw, they're talking about 2035 for petrol cars. So a move for 5 years just seems like a complete no-brainer. And of course, by then, things may, as we get close to that deadline, things may change again because the grid still won't be ready. But that's important. There's lots of things that are relevant there, though, of course, because remember that banning petrol cars does not necessarily mean we will reduce emissions, because we will, for various reasons, that we'll move to more electric cars. But what we'll also create is people being much more reliant on second-hand petrol cars. A market for that will be really, really important because we know the grid won't be ready. People still are suspicious about the length of batteries, how long they last, and so on. So people are more likely to stick with older petrol and diesel cars for longer. And of course, the older the car, the higher emissions are likely to be. It's not impossible that with that enforcing that ban in 2030, we may end up with more CO2 emissions than less. And that's, there's all sorts of unintended consequences. And that's one of the things as an economist, you look at, we can argue about whether we should be doing these policies, but also even if you believe in the climate crisis and you think we've got to move to net zero, how you achieve them is really important. And there's a range of ways. One is to set regulation standards, that sort of thing that governments and the EU have done, emission standards for cars, for example. So you can have regulations. You can tax, you can subsidize, and we can argue about whether that's a good use of public money. The other thing, at the far extreme of policies, is you can ban. You can say, you literally will not sell them. Okay, you can, and you're not allowed to do it. We need to be clear that is only one policy solution. So, for example, when you look at cars, if the government said, well, we're going to have a much more stringent emission target for cars by 2035, how they achieve that is up to them. It could be by electric vehicles, it could be maybe some other technology, it could be really low emission petrol. Now, if you had that, you would see competition amongst the manufacturers, and you would see technological competition for how best to achieve that. And it may be that actually they would see, well, electric vehicles are the only way to do it, but more likely you would see a range of alternatives, and you would let the companies get on with it. And you also, of course, then wouldn't have this sort of forced break where you may get people using petrol cars for longer. So, that's true in all sorts of things. We talked briefly about ULEZ, when you're talking about banning cars, or in Glasgow, they've gone down the line of actually making it illegal to drive cars into an area without being fined. Gas boilers are the same. If you wanted to say, well, okay, we have stricter targets on emissions, how you achieve that is up to you. If you want to have more efficient gas boilers, it may end up being that you end up with much lower emissions than moving to electricity, when we still have a grid that's reliant on things like Drax burning wood pellets imported from Canada and America, or on actually going back to emergency diesel generators, whatever it might be, because we've got this big shift to electricity. So actually, even if you really believe in net zero and the climate disaster, it's not clear that some of these policies, like banning things, is the best way to go.
David, we've been talking for an hour, and I'm sorry to have waffled on at the beginning to stop what's been fascinating from you. So next time I'm going to have to cut that my bit short, but I hope you'll come back and talk to us some more, because what you're saying there, well, clearly an hour isn't long enough to hear all the detail on this, and we need to hear much more about the full range of options there are. We need to hear what the debate should be about, and on what we've been that debate's been denied for most of the last well, in the sort of probably since the era that you were talking about, the beginnings of environmental economics. Much of it's just been sort of, there is no alternative the whole way through.
And I know we've got to end, but I think that's a really important part of the debate. And it was interesting, the reaction to some of these changes over the past 2 weeks from key people, often Tories in government. Like you'd have seen Lord Duncan and the MP's name, Chris Skidmore, isn't it? Both of them took the same line in response to the ULEZ debate and this move to sort of open gas licenses. They said it's really important that the government doesn't play political games over net zero, that we have this consensus between the Conservatives and Labour. And if you think of the subtext of that, what that's saying is it's really important we don't give people a choice. We don't give people a vote. And I think it's actually a disgraceful approach.
Well, that was what Ed Miliband was joining and saying, was complaining that the Tories had broken the bipartisan agreement on climate change. This consensus.
For me, there's a certain panic going on there, because they know as soon as you start having this debate and giving people a choice, as we saw with the ULEZ constituency, then reality sets in. When people have no choice and no option, well, of course, you can get away with it. You can do these really extreme things, like you're a dictatorship. You've got this, this uni party. Once you allow for debate and political differences, then everything falls apart rightly, and we'll end up with a better policy if we can go down that route. So I think we'll see that increasingly over the next months and years, is this desire to more and more shut down the debate. There'll be more painting of people with different views on climate change as extremists who should not be engaged with in debate. There'll be more pressure on politicians to, not allow differences of opinion, and I think we'll see that from the media as well. I wonder if the cat's out of the bag now, and it's too late for them to enforce.
I think not just the cat is out of the bag. I think all of the cats are out of all of the bags, and they cannot be put back in. And it's not just and to mix up the metaphors, the cats are amongst all the pigeons as well. I think they've lost control of I think it was Priti Patel really that sort of pushed it all over into the edge. We're allowed to say what we want now, because they've said it in cabinet, and the people who are saying otherwise just look quite foolish. But look, we're going to come back to this, and what I think we need to do is, I hope I hope this is the sort of beginning of the end, and that's going to be the discussion on the Twitter Spaces. I'm just going to find my banner. Where's my banner? That we're about to start now. Or very shortly. So thanks to, why is there not so many gremlins in here at the moment? Nothing seems to be working. I'm trying to get the closing screen going. No, that's not the closing screen. Well, stuff it. It's probably Ed Miliband sending in the gremlins. Please join us at Twitter Spaces. Right, we're going to see what people think about whether this is the beginning of the end, whether net zero policy consensus has faded and cannot be rescued. Otherwise, thank you, Ed, co-founder of Climate Debate, and thank you to our guest David Paton. And see you all next week. Oh, and don't forget, check out our website, of course, check out our social media, and if you can, please help us out by going to our donate page, and please share our work. Thank you very much. See you next week. Goodbye.